But before we get into the second New Deal, let's talk a little bit about labor organizations during the early part of the Great Depression. Remember, we had talked about in the 1920s how unions were struggling, membership was dropping, and part of the reason why they were struggling so much was their leadership had been jailed and persecuted, right? And so labor organizations really weren't as strong as they were before the 1920s. Well, once we get into the 1930s, we're going to see the rise once again of labor organizations, unions. Okay, 1934, we're going to see a huge wave of strikes with over 2,000 strikes being held just in the year 1934. 2,000 strikes nationwide. It's a lot. Okay, and so labor has rebounded since the 1920s. Okay, in 1935 you'll have the passage of the Wagner Act, and so government is starting to support workers' rights to form unions and to fight for better wages. Because at the time, 1920s going into the 1930s, employers had a lot of power over their workers, right? They could fire them at any time. They could even physically assault them and get away with it, right? Imagine if your boss just attacks you and then like nothing happens. He doesn't go to jail or anything, right? Employers had a lot of power, right? So that's why you have unions, okay? So unions fought for the right to have some kind of input on the whole production process, right? When I say production process, we're talking about like having input on the amount of production, right? Are we going to produce how many beams of steel in this day, right? Like say, what if the manager wants you to produce an extremely large amount of beams of steel and it's going to break people's backs and make them, get injured? Well, maybe workers can step up. Unions are fighting for workers to be able to step up and say, hey, that's not right. It's going to be too much. We need to lower the amount of production. And then the speed of production is another factor as well. Like workers need to have the right to step up and say, hey, we can't produce that much steel, for example, in that period of time. That's not enough time. We need more time. So unions are trying to give workers the right to be able to have a say in the production process. Unions are also trying to fight for seniority rights, right? If you have a job, you probably know what I'm talking about when I say seniority. So if you have been working at a company longer than others, you are less likely to get fired if people are let go, right? Say the economy's not doing so well and the boss has to fire some people. If you've been working there longer, you have seniority, it's less likely that you're going to get fired, right? The people who got hired more recently are going to get fired. Another aspect of seniority is if you've worked at a place for longer than other people, you're more likely to get a promotion, right? If it's time for a promotion, you're probably going to get it because you got seniority rights, right? So unions are fighting for that as well. Okay, so the Wagner Act passed in 1935 is good for workers because it's supporting unionization so that unions will be recognized, which is key because if an employer doesn't recognize a union, they can't fight for them. And so, yes, workers have the right to form unions under the Wagner Act. And so the Wagner Act is also going to support unions by making sure that union elections are legitimate, okay? That the employer is not trying to rig the election so that someone that they want to win wins a position of leadership in the union, you know? The Wagner Act also made it illegal to fire someone or blacklist someone from the industry just because they're part of the union, which was one of the tactics that employers would use to try to break unions, right? Oh, you're a union member, you're causing trouble, you're fired, and I'll make sure that you never work in the steel industry again, right? That kind of thing, right? All right, so let's talk about one of the more powerful unions that developed in the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, okay? Formed in 1935, you have several workers who are going to break away from the American Federation of Labor, which was like the largest union in the country at the time, and they formed the CIO, okay? They're basically arguing that unions are vital to solving the depression, right? People like Huey Long are speaking out and saying, hey, the unions are going to save the country from the depression. Why? Because we're going to get more money for the workers, right? We're going to negotiate. We're going to go on strike. We're going to get higher wages for our workers, for our members. Okay, and that's what's going to solve the depression, right? So that's the idea there. And so the CIO is doing its best to try to fight for workers, and they're much more inclusive than the American Federation of Labor, right? I talked about this before in an earlier module. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is extremely exclusive, meaning that they left a lot of people out, wouldn't allow them to join the union. If you weren't a skilled worker, you couldn't join the union. If you were a person of color, most likely you're not going to be allowed into the union. So yeah, the American Federation of Labor, extremely exclusive. The CIO, much more inclusive. Welcomes, right? They welcome African American workers. They welcome Mexican American workers into their union, right? And they're doing their best to fight against discrimination in the workplace. So the CIO has a big impact in the 1930s and moving forward, okay? One thing that the CIO is calling for is industrial democracy, okay? Industrial democracy, the right of workers to control various aspects of production, right? We were talking about to give workers some power in the production process, right? Not just get ordered around by management. Okay, you're working a 12-hour day today. We need to, speed up production. No, workers need to have a say in the production process, and that's an aspect of industrial democracy, right? Having a voice, that's democracy, right? And industrial democracy also means receiving proper wages for what you're doing. You know what I mean? Like if you're working in an industry that's making millions of dollars and you're only getting paid like 35 cents an hour, you're like, this doesn't make sense. Why is the owner of the company, part of the 1%, like this millionaire, and I'm getting paid these low wages and it's my labor that's making him a millionaire? Doesn't make sense. That's not democracy. And so workers are calling for industrial democracy. Okay, and so one of the tactics that the CIO would use was the sit down. Okay, the sit down is a form of a strike. Normally in a strike, workers have planned to walk out of the job on a certain day at a certain time, right? That's what the union does. It organizes the strike, right? But in a sit down, it's a little bit different. Okay, yeah, the workers stop working, but instead of leaving the site, they stay there and take over the factory. They occupy it. Okay, and this could work. This is a pretty strong strategy. It was actually the fear of this strategy, the sit down, that helped to push one of the most powerful corporations in the country, U.S. Steel, to finally recognize the steel workers union. Okay, because before that, U.S. Steel was not trying to recognize the union, and if not recognized, the union cannot negotiate on behalf of the workers. Okay, so the sit down, pretty powerful tactic. So ultimately, you see the rise once again of labor organizations who are fighting for workers' rights in the 1930s.